Hello, everybody, and welcome into another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Monday, January 6th, 2025. I'm your host, George Kirk, joined by the one and only Cody Roadcap. I promise we're not fighting yet, but just wait until like Sunday morning.
Sunday morning. I don't even know if I want to do the show with you on Thursday.
And you're going to see me in person on Saturday.
Maybe. You might
Yeah, you
irritate
say
me.
maybe. It's going to be a great time. So this show will be civil-ish, but we'll see what happens on Thursday as Cody's using them fighting words. But looking forward to talking the end of the regular season where you got some fantasy awards today and get ready for the playoffs.
Yeah, should be a ton of fun. And that key matchup we're talking about is obviously Packers-Eagles. I don't know why George is so we can be civil today. The game he cares about is on Saturday anyways. Texans-Chargers, 1 o'clock again. So
4
watching
o'clock.
whatever. 1 o'clock is the same word as early window.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that works. We'll talk more about that, if not today, on our Thursday show. Make sure you're catching us 6:30 East, Mondays and Thursdays on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure you also follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok at The Couch GMs to get even more than you do from the show. You can DM us your questions or comments or drop them in while we're on the show live. All right, Cody, a lot to talk about. Why don't we sit back, relax, and chat? The Monday after the regular season ends in the NFL is typically known as Black Monday, but the Patriots decided to just pull the trigger on Sunday before the next slate of games was even over, firing head coach Gerard Mayo after one season. Part of me is really sad we didn't get to see the rant that Gronk was going to put on before Fox cut him off. I don't know if you saw that.
I did see the clip, and I guess that's something we'll never know what was gonna, because it was weird. Like if you watch the whole thing, it was like, well, is he gonna actually say something, or was he just really trying to gather his thoughts? But it was definitely weird how they, you know, cut him off like that.
I think they were worried that he was going to say something that was not great for TV, especially because he had the personal relationship with Mayo. I don't know if it was as a player, but definitely he was on the coaching staff while he was still in New England. I guess it might have been both.
I'm pretty sure it was both. I don't think he was on the coaching. Mayo, I think, just started coaching in 2019.
Okay. So that would have been just post Gronk.
Because that was one of the things they're talking about when he did get fired or hired, was he's only been coaching since 2019. He kind of only had 1 year as a DC, like the inexperience, and that was another reason why he fell short, was because he also had a bunch of inexperienced coaches around him. And unfortunate, it seemed like it was a tough decision for the Crafts, but I think you said it. It feels like Mike Vrabel is the guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I understand people are like, if they wanted Mike Vrabel that bad, they could have just got him last year. And I understand that, but it does put you 1 year removed from having to be the guy to follow Bill Belichick, as much as you don't want to be that guy. And it's also coincidence that the Vrabel was like, hey, I'm going to interview for the Jets. And then it was like, well, I don't know. We might not get rid of Mayo. Oh, he's interviewing for the Jets. Out. Like, it might have just
and literally on Sunday, you never see it the same day, at least most of the time. Normally it's like, oh, we know this is going to be his last game. There was no indications of that, at least that I heard.
It started to, like I said, it started to come out more and more that they were planning to move on Sunday morning after again, it could just be a simple coincidence, but after the Vrabel to the New York Jets, and I think Diana Rossini even put it out there that that was almost a calculated move by Vrabel because he's interested in the Patriots job, and he was like, he knew that would get under some skin. So hey, we'll see what happens. There's a lot to play out, and there could always be a surprise change as we get closer to an actual hire.
Definitely. And then somebody we've been talking about, I feel like most of the season, the Jaguars parted ways with Doug Peterson. It actually had gotten to the point where I was questioning if he was going to stay. And I think you even said it last week. Like, I think there's a chance he survives this one, given the pedigree, the fact that he is a Super Bowl winning coach. But he did finally get Jags are finally moving on from him. That was a great stumble by me. Go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, I think this is like they're going to go all in on like a guy like Ben Johnson.
Hmm.
Uh, they have a
If he
quarterback.
finally goes, like there has to be a point where the Lions can't keep holding together that coaching staff, right?
No, and I was going to talk about this when we talked about that game, but I'll just talk about it now. It's interesting because them getting the 1 seed allows their coordinators to interview this week. Now it
Hmm.
is virtual, but that's newer rules over the last couple of years. It used to be you have to wait till that player team was eliminated, but now because they have the bye week, they can interview so they can start to get a head start on there. I don't expect either of them to take away from what Detroit's doing and announce that they're going to go somewhere. I mean, but we saw this last year. The Seattle Seahawks knew they wanted Mike McDonald as their head coach, and they were going to be like, all right, we know it's going to be you. We're just going to, keep doing our thing, stay status quo. Once your playoff run ends, it ended in the AFC Championship, and then they hired him. So I think they're going to be willing to wait. I think Ben Johnson is a guy that they're going to go after. I think their owner has the paycheck, the wallet, however you want to describe it, to pay up to pry him from Detroit. My biggest question is, does he want to work with Trent Baalke? Because I do not know how that GM continues to get opportunity after opportunity.
How many head coaches is this now that he's survived? At least 2 or 3.
Yeah. Now, I will say it is being reported that they're shaking up the structure. The head coach will report directly to the owner. We've started to see that more and more common, not as a direct where owner, GM, and sometimes even the cap guy or head coach, GM, cap guy, instead of all reporting the GM, all report to the owner. And I think that's going to be the situation in Jacksonville. But I also wouldn't be surprised if, they talked to Ben Johnson later this week, and he's like, "Hey, I'll come there, but I want to bring the assistant GM from Detroit with me because we have a good working relationship to be the GM." If the owner wants him that bad, I wouldn't put it past the Jags to be like, "All right, we're going to let Balky go."
Yeah, and that's interesting to see because normally you would put a GM in place and then you would find a head coach, with that GM, as opposed to a coach bringing in a GM. But there's even I think it was the Jets were starting to do head coach interviews without a GM in place. So you've seen it both ways.
Yeah, and I think that's because a lot more teams are going into this structure of the GM reports the owner, the head coach reports the owner. So like they have to have a good working relationship, but they're not quote unquote the boss. So and heck, the Jets owner picks players based on Madden ratings. We talked about that earlier.
And
So
has to deny that his 17, 18-year-old son actually helps him with football decisions.
so the Jets just being the Jets. Uh, but I think the GM situation in Jacksonville is very interesting because if you remember, back when they hired Doug Peterson, everyone thought that they were going to get Byron Leftwich, offense coordinator for the Buccaneers, coming off their Super Bowl run with Tom Brady, former Jacksonville Jaguars quarterback, and he's like, I don't want to work with Balky, and
Mhm.
they pivoted. Now he's not, it didn't work out for him, staying as offense coordinator. He actually became the scapegoat and hasn't, gotten that opportunity to apply for head coaching jobs again. But Jacksonville is a mess right now, but they have Trevor Lawrence. They have a top 5 pick. They have $60+ million in cap space. And the key to that is they're also in a division that's not that hard.
Yeah, the only team that you have in there that's competitive at this moment, you can argue, is the Texans, and they're one of the rockiest teams in the AFC playoff picture. The Colts are always competitive, but they just haven't been able to put it together to anything meaningful over the last 5 years.
I don't think they've made the playoffs in a very they're in one of their longest playoff droughts under Jim Irsay. I want to say it's 10 years, but that just sounds wild and also make me feel really old. If but like have they made the playoffs since Andrew Luck left? And how long ago was that?
That was a while ago. Let me see if I can look that up.
All right, while you look it up when the Colts last playoff is, we'll talk about the Colts though. Despite their lack of success over the years, they are going another year with GM Chris Ballard and head coach Shane Steichen. After that loss to the Giants, they were considering moving on. Jim Irsay decided to back them, so the Colts regime is in place. Dolphins also sticking out with Mike McDaniel and Chris Greer, I believe is their GM's name. And then the Giants, despite being the laughingstock of Hard Knocks, despite moving on from Offensive Player of the Year Saquon Barkley and defensive player of the year candidate Xavier McKinney, they are running it back with Brian Daboll and GM, which honestly, there was reports all weekend that they were going to move on from just Daboll and keep the GM in place. I like that they stayed tied together, and if it doesn't work next year, they rip the whole Band-Aid instead of doing this 1 year with a new head coach, then trying to find a GM that still wants that head coach. Like, tie them together and see what happens.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens with their quarterback search now that they are free of Daniel Jones, have that top pick and whatever. Colts situation here. They did make the playoffs in 2020. First round loss to the Buffalo Bills, one of those great wild card Saturdays that they have every single year, basically. And then their last playoff win was in 2018 against the Houston Texans.
Okay. So they did have a playoff win. I was going to say maybe it was a playoff win, but it's been a while.
So it's been a while. 2018 last win, 2020 last appearance. It's up there near the top of streaks for teams at this point.
Do you have like who was which? Was the Texans the home team in that one?
It was at Texans and at Bills, so they were wild card teams.
I think it's been 10 years since they won the division. I think that's what it was.
2014 home game against Cincinnati with a win. Yes, that would be correct.
I knew I saw something kind of wild stat about that, but then I was like, the more I think about it, that makes sense.
Yep. And that was, I think, the last Andrew Luck year. So I think you're right there.
Yeah. Or was that Phillip Rivers?
Might have been Phillip Rivers. Might have been 2013 with Andrew Luck. We're getting too far down the Colts rabbit hole. Other thing that I heard that you didn't mention is Jerry Jones said he is retaining the GM status on the Dallas Cowboys. So we're going to have to see what their head coaching situation looks like, as their coach is set to have his contract expire in about 8 days. But Jerry Jones remaining the GM.
Surprised.
Not surprised at all, but it's at least something that was reported.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what happens with Mike McCarthy, though. You mentioned that his contract is up January 14th. So the Cowboys have exclusive negotiating rights, although the Chicago Bears did request permission to interview with him today. And I don't believe there's been an answer yes if they've granted that or not. But I think that might even start to give you a hint of where they're going and what direction, if they give that permission or not.
That is a good point. I would think with how it seems that McCarthy and Jones' working relationship is, he would let him search out other jobs if they're not expecting him to come back. Although the Cowboys have a history of dragging their feet too.
That is a valid point for sure.
And then finally, speaking of people potentially wanting out, Tyreek Hill down in Miami had a post-game press conference where he told some reporters that he was out. He is out. So I think he's going to be requesting a trade anytime now.
I think he indirectly already asked it. It sounds like he can't.
Indirectly.
It sounded like he even pulled himself out of the game on Sunday. Granted, if you were watching the scoreboard, you knew their season was done. He even said, "I'm banged up. I've been fighting through injuries." We knew he was playing through a wrist injury. And if you're seeing the scoreboard, you see, well, we're not making the playoffs, so I'm going to pull myself out, which, I mean, I understand it to some degree, but I also think like you can't quit on your team too. Also, if you're following him on Twitter, he'll probably say he got hacked, but he did change his profile picture to a Photoshop of his head on the Antonio Brown jumping in the Jet Stadium. So I think it sounds like he quit on his team for sure. But I'm really interested.
Bro, what?
I'll have to send it to you, unless it's already been changed and he said it. Like you said, he's claimed it was hacked, but it happened at some
We'll
point. We'll
find it somewhere. If it went on the internet once, it's on the internet forever.
That's very true. But my whole thing is he only has 1 year left on his deal. And there has been talks that he was going to only play out this contract and retire. He said that.
Yep.
I don't think he gets traded without a new deal.
Yeah, and he's what, 2 more years, I want to say, on that deal?
No, this next year will be his last year.
Oh.
So that I think it gets very interesting on, like, does he stick to, or, stick true to his word that I'm going to play out my contract? Or does he go to a team? Maybe he goes for a homecoming with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce for one last ride. Chargers are the betting favorites to get him. They could use him. I don't know how he would fit in he'd be great for Justin Herbert, but I don't know how he would fit with Harbaugh. But I think that's going to be one of the fascinating stories of what happens with Tyreek Hill as we move throughout the offseason.
And we'll keep an eye on that one, as we might have hashtag Tyreek Watch moving into the offseason. But a couple of games we wanted to talk about before we move out of this window and into some awards. Starting off with that battle for the 1 seed, that was not much of a battle once we really got into that game. The Lions came to play against the Vikings.
Yeah, they did come to play. I think we saw that the home field advantage meant more to them, and we talked about that. Like, if the Lions didn't get home field, I would have considered picking the Rams to beat them this week. Now that they got it, I'm pretty sure I would, when we do our predictions of the playoffs, I'm predicting them to go to the Super Bowl, possibly winning the whole thing. Seeing how that all plays out, I will say, congrats on them. They played their heart out. That game was really close until about halfway through the third quarter when they broke it open. We started to see the refs let them play, which meant there was a lot of holding calls that went undone. But you like to see them have to play aggressive football in the playoffs, and we're accustomed to that.
Yes.
But there was at least 6 touchdowns that Sam Darnold missed, and that's what I'm paying attention to, because a week ago we were talking about how does Sam Darnold not come back to Minnesota? How do they move on from J.J. McCarthy? Biggest game of the year, he folded under the pressure. Now, granted, he was hit around a lot. He took more hits in the first half than he did in like the last 5 games. Like, he was hit up, but he missed some throws, he missed some reads. Although Dan Campbell did say to Kevin O'Connell when he was shaking his hand, we'll see you in 2 weeks. So they're expecting the Vikings to bounce back and play them. Also means he's not expecting the Commanders or the Packers to win, which would be the way that they would have to play the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, I was about to say that exact same thing, so I'm glad you jumped in there. But I was going to say, too, I did start to see the cracks forming in Minnesota, and I still think that they're going to be the favorites in their first-round matchup, but this is where you're going to look at their quarterback position.
I'm not worried about them against the Rams at all.
No. The Rams, as good of a coach team they are, they're not the greatest team. At this point, with how hot the Bucs are, they probably are the weakest team in the NFC playoffs.
They haven't scored 20 points in 5 weeks. And granted, they didn't play anybody last week, but they were playing people the 4 weeks prior to that.
Yeah, but the cracks are starting to show in Minnesota. I mean, they were winning games, even at times in the year when we were praising them, off of defense in the run game. Like, Darnold was doing a great job of taking care of the ball. He had some big games. He was still making plays. He looked like a much different version of himself than we saw through his entire career. But there's still something there that it's like he's not an elite quarterback, and we have to remember that. And I'm interested to see how that comes to fruition. If not in round 1, when you get past round 1 and you have to play a Lions and Eagles, something like that.
Well, I mean, look at both quarterbacks. The Vikings were able to get pressure early, and Jared Goff looked pedestrian. I put Jared Goff, he's better than Sam Darnold, don't get me wrong. But I think they're closer in terms of, like, they are guys that rely on their system. They are efficient when the read is there and pressure gets to them. That's 98% of the quarterbacks in the league. There's very few Lamar Jacksons, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes that just can extend and make plays happen. So I don't want to sound like I'm discrediting them. They were able to lock down, and this team gets going. I saw, but I don't know. Are we just jumping into games right now? I think we just jumped into games.
Yeah, we're in games.
Perfect. I saw Andy Holloway of the Fantasy Footballers put this out on Twitter, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Did the Lions accidentally get better because they had to give Jahmyr Gibbs full-time work?
That's a possibility, because the man's just explosive. And as good as David Montgomery is, you don't necessarily need your change of pace back to be getting 50-50 carries. I don't think that's going to be something they're going to change, because obviously they still had success with it. And at this point, you can look at it as they were saving Gibbs for this part of the season in the playoffs. Gibbs is going to be one of the freshest running backs going into the playoffs, despite how much they run the ball, because he was splitting so heavily with David Montgomery for most of the season. But I do think their offense is better with his dual threat ability, with not only on the ground and how explosive he is, but he can still catch passes as well. Like, maybe they did accidentally get better. And maybe this is going to serve them better for a playoff run. But I still think that their overall formula for during a regular season should stick to more to how they have done it in the past 2 seasons.
And it is worth noting that it sounds like David Montgomery might be back as early as the divisional round. So,
and that will be interesting to see. Number one, how many carries they would give him because of his health. But number two, if they see the offense struggling more than it has these last few weeks, if they do give Gibbs more touches.
yeah, just something to pay attention to. And like the Vikings could very much end up playing the Lions again. And I think they'll have better answers. And this game, just like nothing went the Vikings' way. I mean, they were 0-4 in the red zone. They missed a field goal. Like, they just couldn't get together. And again, not discrediting the Detroit Lions. Like, I'm probably picking them to go to the Super Bowl at this point.
Yeah.
But I think I think the game will be much closer. And I don't think it'll be, an automatic W for the Lions if these two face off in 2 weeks or even 3 weeks.
Well, I mean, their path to the Super Bowl is going to be tough. Maybe not as tough as the teams that didn't get the bye, because like you're talking about that 3-headed monster of the Eagles, the Packers, and the Vikings that we've been mentioning. The Commanders aren't a joke. The Bucks are hot, and then there's the Rams, but the Rams are still going to be a decent team. But like the Lions beat up on the Vikings this time. It's going to be the third time they're seeing them if they see them again in the playoffs. It'd be the third time that they're seeing the Packers if they see them again in the playoffs. If they see the Eagles, I think the Eagles, as long as Hurts is back, are a better overall team than the Vikings are. Like, there's not an easy path for them.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that about every team too. Like, I mean, the Eagles have to play the Packers, who you're more scared of than if it was going to be the Commanders.
I would have rather said the Commanders, yes.
The Vikings now have to go on the road to LA. Then they'll have to turn around on a short week. I think is going to be the most interesting thing about that one, is they're going to get 1 day less rest. Obviously, they're going to play on Sunday. There's no Monday night games. But how does that fare for them if they have to go to the 1 seed or go to Philadelphia? Either one, that'll be
especially if they have to go to Detroit. That's a good point. They'd have 6 days rest versus a team on a bye.
Yeah. So they didn't get any benefits from the schedule. So like losing that game definitely hurt playoff chances for either team, because going on the road, then a short week to, in all likelihood, I mean, I guess you would have to say, assuming that the favorites win, maybe I don't have the spreads in front of me. Maybe the Commanders they're not favorites over the Bucks. I don't think, not at home. It's probably more.
I don't think so. No,
I would imagine the only road favorite is the Vikings.
I would imagine so.
At least on the NFC side. I'm not talking AFC at this moment.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. But so if you're looking at it, favorites win, they would be going to Detroit. Exactly. And third game, obviously not easy for Detroit, but that's not.
Third game 2 times in 3 weeks. Also, we see
and
that.
A team on extra rest. Like it's not lining up good for the Vikings, but there's some things that are benefiting them when it comes to familiarity.
Speaking of the Vikings and kind of throwing it back into our earlier conversation, going on a completely different tangent. Did you see Jay Glazer's report on Fox Sunday morning before the 1:00 games, where Kevin O'Connell is the surprise candidate that teams are going to try to trade for because his contract is up and they haven't done an extension yet?
Wow. That would be something.
He has 1 year left. I think it's not officially up.
Okay.
He has 1 year left. I think was the actual report. So don't want to spread misinformation there. There's no way in heck that actually, like, how do they even get to that?
I'm assuming it's just one of those, like, they've been sputtering out in the playoffs, but I think his resume speaks for himself as we look at it, as he resurrected Sam Darnold's career. We saw what Kirk Cousins looked like not in his offense. It wasn't pretty. He is up there in my mind in status of offensive coaches, along with like the Kyle Shanahan, the Mike McDaniel, where it's like they have a system that is nearly quarterback proof.
Yeah.
I guess maybe Mike McDaniel's not in that conversation. I'm sorry. Kyle Shanahan's the big one.
Yeah.
Sean McVay is probably the other one.
So then let's do this hypothetical. How many first round picks would it take? Like, at what point would you be like, okay, you know what? Maybe we can just hire the offensive coordinator, or like if the New York Jets said we're going to give you 3 first-round picks and Aaron Rodgers. They're not going to give him Aaron Rodgers, but that was just a funny way to throw.
That's a funny throw-in, yeah. How many
What do you-
first-round picks is Aaron Rodgers? I'm just kidding. He's not worth a first-round pick. I think 3 is at least the minimum, but I don't know if teams would spend more than 3. If you're like, it has to be 4, I mean, what horrible teams to do that? The Bears? You wouldn't do that in division, though.
That's what I'm saying. Like the Jets. Like
What
the Jets,
poorly run teams? The Jets is a pretty poorly run team. How high is McConnell's Madden rating?
they don't rate coaches. But
I know. I'm being funny.
he might have an X factor. I don't know. Madden's gotten crazy.
There's home field advantages. I don't know if there's coach advantages, though.
He probably has a Madden Ultimate Team card. What's the higher rating on that? Maybe it's
I don't know.
or so. I don't know. I don't play Madden Ultimate Team.
No.
But yeah, I thought that was an interesting report that I didn't see anything how that would happen. But especially with like, there's only 5 openings right now. Like, I feel like there's plenty of candidates to go around.
And that's where it's interesting. Like, there's so many people that we were looking at, like, our potential head coaches at this point. And there's going to be a lot of people staying put just because there's not a lot of openings. Because there's even, former head coaches that are getting looks like a Mike Vrabel. And then there's slam dunk candidates who have been kind of waiting in the wings, like Ben Johnson. Even if you just have those 2 out, 3 head coach openings, not a whole lot of movement this year.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still could be more to come. Like, I know the Bengals did fire Lou Anarumo, so it sounds like Zach Taylor's safe, but that one's still up in the air. Antonio Pierce still up in the air.
He seems like he's trending towards safe with how they were just like letting him have a press conference today and such. But yeah,
having a press conference doesn't mean you're safe. Just ask Matt.
You're right. Chicago taught us that lesson. My bad.
But really, I don't see any playoff teams potentially firing their head coach.
There's the most I've heard, and this is probably because Philly sports radio is a joke, is that if the Eagles go out in the first round, does Sirianni get fired? But I don't see that happening. He's one of the top 2 successful head coaches in the first 4 years in NFL history. So
yeah, he's won a ton of games. I don't see that happening. I know there's people saying the same thing on Packers about Matt LaFleur. I'm like, the dude is second all time in wins in their first 100 wins. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like,
no, those are the ones where it's the passionate fans who want to have success. You haven't gotten over the hump, but they've been successful coaches that don't deserve to go anywhere.
The one that I could see potentially would be if McVay steps away.
That's a little different.
No, he's not getting
would
fired.
Have to step away. You're right. Yeah.
If like Stafford hangs it up and McVay's like, you know what, I don't want to do this with a rookie quarterback. Maybe he'll talk Aaron Rodgers into coming to the Rams or something like that. But for one last ride,
I don't think Rodgers is going. We'll have Rodgers talk later. Okay, whatever. Couple pairs of games. What was that?
I said sorry for that tangent.
No, it's all good. We've been this show's all about tangents. We're in postseason mode where we have the time to dive into some topics like this. But couple of games that happened that go in pairs. Commanders at Cowboys and Bears at Packers, which led to a really good witching hour in the 1 o'clock window. Cowboys blowing the lead to Commanders at the end, and the Packers getting the lead and then losing it on a last-second field goal, which shifted the NFC playoff picture, making it Packers going to Philly and Commanders going to Tampa Bay. Would have been opposite if both of those things hadn't happened at the buzzer.
Yeah, and if one of them still happened, the other one didn't.
Yeah,
it would have still been the way it is now. But yeah, it was interesting because both games featured their quarterbacks going out. Love got banged up. It sounded like Daniels was a coaching decision, but then afterwards they're like, he had some leg soreness, so we wanted to be cautious, and they were losing with him. And then Mariota came in. Fun fact, saw this on Twitter. Mariota has more red zone touchdown passes this year than Anthony Richardson, and Mariota didn't start a single game. So that's just, fun random oddball stat out there for Tyler.
I feel like we're just punching the Colts today, among other teams, and it's kind of a good time.
We're just jumping on the Pat McAfee bandwagon about tear down the Colts. So he gets
leaving his suite empty during the final game. I liked it.
But Yeah, Packers Bears. I don't know how much you paid attention on that one because I know your Eagles were still playing in somewhat of a meaningless game, but we're diehards. We watch our team most.
Yep.
The Packers got stuck in no man's land of do we want to win this game or do we not want to, win this game? They Love went out. They didn't really play Josh Jacobs in the second half. They then got the game close and put like Kenny Clark back in on the last drive after not playing him the whole second half. Had one of the worst defensive calls I've ever seen and not understanding clock management. It made Matt Eberflus look like a genius. And they lost Christian Watson to torn ACL. So not only sucks for him, most and foremost, sucks for the playoffs because he's our best offensive player. He only had like 30 catches. I don't even think he had 30 catches on the season, but he does so much in the run game, opens things up. His speed opens things up underneath. Huge part of our offense and makes his status for 2025 up in the air, which sucks for that one as well. So it just goes to show that these teams, even though the records are just, the margins are still razor thin. And if you don't show up and put your full foot forward, you're going to get beat. And that's exactly what happened to the Packers. Granted, luckily they had one of their worst games in a non-playoff game, and hopefully they can bounce back. But after two bad losses, really, it's been a slow start. So I know George is still scared, but it has definitely hurt my optimism.
I mean, the Vikings game means, more to me than this does. Basically playing half throttle, trying not to get people hurt, but then obviously having Lug banged up and then having Christian Watson tear the ACL. Like, that's not good. Like, I would have rather them gone all out. And if that happened, then it would have been like, well, we were trying for something. It almost feels like, it happened for nothing when they were kind of playing half throttle. But because they were playing half throttle against a division rival, that loss doesn't mean a whole lot to me when it comes to like me looking at the Packers as a playoff contender.
I guess we'll have to wait and see on how it goes, and we'll see if we're talking after next Sunday.
I will talk to you regardless, Cody. Need it for the fans. There's a good moment.
Our hearts were not very good. Make sure if you want to see bad hand hearts, head over to YouTube / the Couch GMs podcast
or our Facebook page. But Bills at Patriots and Texans at Titans. I know, horrible games. Bills played nobody. Patriots played a backup quarterback who looked fantastic, actually. Shout out Joe Milton. But this game with the Pats winning and then firing their head coach gives the Titans the #1 overall pick. A major upset when you consider they were 3rd or 4th going into last week, needed a Giants loss, needed a Patriots loss, got both. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, crazy. And we'll have a lot to talk about the whole what that means for the 1 seed. Do they trade it? Do they keep it? Does Shador want to go to Tennessee? AK, does Dion want to go to Tennessee? Not the head coach, but is that a big enough market for them? A lot to break down. And shout out to the Pats for getting a win. And that was definitely a situation where, like, once he got the win, it wasn't so much I thought, him winning was going to be the reason he lost his job. But the fact that I know, they say players are players. They're playing for next year. They want a good film out there. But if you're a head coach and you're safe, like, do you maybe punt and not go for it? Like, do you take a field goal when you really should go for it kind of thing? Or go for it when a field goal gives you the win? Kind of like.
I know what you're saying. I kind of feel like Mayo was on the same exact boat as the players were. He's trying to get good footage out there. He's trying to, audition for his next position. I get it. Like, he's probably going to be a coordinator again, more than likely, rather than a head coach right away. But if you can take it to a head coaching interview 3, 4, 5 years down the road and be like, I don't care if we have 3 wins. I'm coaching for a win. I'm prepping this team. I'm a leader. That can only help him. So I think, and I mean, if you were safe, yeah, maybe you were kind of like playing it easier. You're trying to set yourself up for next year. But if he assumed he was on the way out, I think he was going for that win as much as the players were for the same reason.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the same thing with Lovie Smith and the Texans a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Lovie Smith didn't know what was going to happen, and he went out and got a win, costing the number one pick. He was let go later that night or the next day. So,
Yep.
definitely a situation worth monitoring on those two teams and how it all shakes out. Which, you know what? I'll say this question for another day.
Are you sure?
Yeah, because I want to wait till we know all the head. The question was, so you can brew on it and think about it for next week or in the office. Which head coach vacancy is most appealing? But until we get the final count, what happens? I'll save that question for another day.
We'll save it for probably what'll end up being Thursday, but we'll see what kind of time we have when we go into our playoff breakdowns. You have Dolphins Jets on here as our last game to look at.
Yeah, I just wanted to shout this one out. I know the first quarter wasn't great, but Aaron Rodgers eclipsed, and I know people are tired of me talking about him, but I don't care. He's my favorite player of all time, so it's my show. I'll do what I want. 500 passing touchdowns, joins elite company, already was a first ballot Hall of Famer, but kind of got to go out having fun, a 4-touchdown game, and just it was kind of a cool moment. He got to walk off the field with Devontae Adams, and I do think that was the last time we're going to see him play on the football field. Could be completely wrong, could change, but it's not a Super Bowl. But going out on a 4-touchdown day performance, throwing touchdowns to some of your best friends, like, congrats on him.
Maybe his time in New York was more successful for him than it was for the Jets, but congrats to Aaron Rodgers if he does head out. If he is still here next year, I'm interested to see where he is playing. But Cody, I think that's enough about this past week. Why don't we look at our fantasy football awards for 20? I didn't know you had a bumper. Thank you.
Me neither. I just saw it and I was like, well, he doesn't know. I got to click it and interrupt him.
Oh, man. All right. Why don't we start on a low note? And we're going to start with our most disappointing player of the year.
So how are we doing this? Are we alternating who gets the final say?
Let's do that because we did not pick them up front like we usually do. So we'll name our nominees. You'll be 2. I'll random number generator while you talk about our first candidate here.
All right. Most disappointing player for the fantasy football season. We have 3 nominees for this one, starting off at the quarterback position. 1, Mr. CJ Stroud, after a strong end to his rookie season, high expectations, was drafted as quarterback 5 and finished all the way down as QB 18. Such a disappointment. At running back, we have Brees Hall, who was drafted as running back 2/3. A lot of coin flip between him and Bijan Robinson. Top 5 pick in most leagues. Finished as RB 17. Then Tyreek Hill, the guy who wants out of Miami, had one of his worst seasons as a pro. Still finished as a top 24 wide receiver at wide receiver 21. But in most leagues was the 2nd overall player drafted. And I think it's just worth noting that we are pretty much eliminating injuries from this conversation. So while CMC was the 101, and the disappointment was how the 49ers handled that situation, so we couldn't be better prepared for it during draft season, because of the injuries, he was not a person that we nominated for this award.
All right, Cody, 1 or 2?
2.
It is 1. I will have final say on the first one here. Any arguments to make for me for any of them before I talk?
I think the 2 that I'm looking at is CJ Stroud and Tyreek Hill. And that 102 spot for me has to make it the most disappointing. CJ Stroud, quarterback 5, went ahead of guys like Joe Burrow. Anthony Richardson went, right after him. So, there was still that was just a rough range anyways. And then Brees Hall, he did have a couple injuries. It wasn't a full slate of seasons. He might have been able to get back into the top 12 if he played a full slate. So for me, it's Tyreek Hill, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
See, I was also between Stroud and Tyreek Hill. I actually saw some fantasy playoff teams in multiple of my leagues that were playing CJ Stroud despite, his struggles, even though they made the fantasy playoffs. So as bad as he was, like, I don't think the gap was quite there compared to how much you needed Tyreek Hill to go off, and it just didn't happen. So I'm going to go ahead and award our most disappointing player of the year to Tyreek Hill. Still a viable player, but it was not good.
I will say I 100% agree with your situation with going with Tyreek Hill. His only saving grace was his one of his top 5 fantasy performances came championship weekend. So if you made it there, he had a good week in the championship week. So
if you made it there and played him, I know there were situations where I didn't even want to play him at points. It was bad. I mean, he was affected by the Tua situation earlier in the year too, but it was a bumpy road with Tyreek Hill this year, and drafting him at 102, it's not something you want to deal with. 101 and 102 were rough this year. It was a weird year in general, especially for the waiver wire, where we're looking at our waiver wire pickup of the year, which was a lot harder than we expected it to be. There wasn't really a clear-cut guy this year. So our nominees at quarterback, we had Bo Nix, the rookie quarterback, finished as QB7 despite an ADP of 173. He was a free agent pretty much everywhere, even if he was drafted. He got dropped at some point. We got the running back duo in San Francisco of Jordan Mason and Isaac Guerrero. Obviously, mostly Jordan Mason, as he got you through the first part of the season, first half of the season, I guess it was, until CMC came back. And then when CMC got hurt, Mason did as well. Isaac Guerrero kind of got you into the fantasy playoffs. Also at running back, we had Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving started off pretty slow, but as the season went on, he really took over in Tampa Bay and actually had a very good fantasy playoffs. And then wide receiver, we have Jerry Jeudy, who finished as wide receiver 15 despite an ADP of wide receiver 57. He was somebody who down the stretch could fill in a spot for somebody that had been struggling, like a Tyreek Hill.
Yeah. So I guess that means it's my turn to pick this one. A lot of great options here, right? And I think if Jordan Mason would have stayed healthy, that would have been the clear winner. But he wasn't able to stay healthy. Then Guerrero came in, looked good, also couldn't stay healthy. So I think they have an argument combined. Bucky Irving, incredible year for the rookie as well. Bo Nix, what he was able to do, come in as later in the season and really light it up. But unless you have any compelling arguments for why it's not Jerry Jeudy, I'm going to go ahead and take him as the winner of the waiver wire pickup. And I think some of that is because we had some back and forth. Do we trust it? There was weeks of not trusting it. And in PPR formats, which is a little bit different than half point PPRs we normally talk about. But since week 8, he only had 1 week where he didn't score more than 11 points.
Absolutely crazy. And it came during the fantasy playoffs, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, it was week 16. It was when they benched Winston for DTR. He had 4 points, but then he bounced back. And, some people got scared again, myself included, not playing him with DTR. And he ended up putting up 21.4 points, half or full point PPR points.
Thank you, Bailey Zappi. I'm just kidding. It was DTR again.
Bailey Zappi put up 12 in week 18 if you were one of those people that play in week 18 as well.
Jerry Jeudy coming out of nowhere despite his Madden rating to win waiver wire pickup of the year. On to our most improved player of the year. Starting at quarterback, someone we mentioned earlier in the show for the playoff bound Minnesota Vikings, it's Sam Darnold. I mean, Darnold was kind of somebody who you could play in a pinch if you needed it, but I mean, he wasn't one of the guys off the waiver wire we were playing all the time. But when you consider where he came from to where he was, it was a major improvement. Looking at what we're looking at on this award here. Also at quarterback, we had Bryce Young after a first year where we expected him to do so much and he did nothing. And then even a benching earlier this season, his second half of the year was actually startable in fantasy. And some people did ride his coattails of his second half of the year to some success near the end of the season. And then at wide receiver, somebody who we had a lot of expectations on, another young guy, Jackson Smith and Jigba. who finished as wide receiver 10, overtaking DK Metcalf as the wide receiver 1 in Seattle.
Yeah, I think that is an impressive, for me, what he was able to do. He was drafted as wide receiver 42, so he was still high up there. 100th player overall, so still a pretty high pick. So maybe that's where the improved part of it. But because he became the clear number one, I think that's why we're giving it in there. And then I just want to, before you make your decision, give a shout out to Bryce Young, who, when you look at his fantasy football stats, I'm going to read you his through week 7. Okay. Now, granted, there was a benching in there as well, and then Dalton got hurt. But he had 9.6 in week 1, 2, 3.1, negative 0.2. Those were his stats through 7 weeks. Only played 4 games. Those were his stats.
Bad.
Let me read you his last, we'll go week 13 on.
Okay.
We'll go week 12 on. 16.5, 23.6, 12.5, 12.0, a little bit of a down spot, then finishes out 27.1, 16.9, 36.4 in week 18. Obviously, that doesn't help a ton of people in fantasy football, and this is a fantasy football award. But just if we're going by the word improved, I don't know if you can make an argument that there's not a player that improved more over the course of one season compared to multiple seasons.
It's very true. But I'm trying to balance the fact that it's like improved plus fantasy football. And I think the person who made the biggest impact and still had a major improvement was Jackson Smith-Njigba. So I'm going to give him the award for most improved player of the year.
I don't hate it. That's why I just had to defend Bryce Young, which Dave Canales did come out and say, we got our guy. So it doesn't sound like he's going anywhere, which after the way he's looked the last month of the season, no surprise there.
They're starting to get it together, and people are starting to realize that quarterbacks might need a little bit more seasoning than we've been giving them over the past 2 decades.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. But next up is talking about seasoning. We're talking rookies of the year. There's a lot of great.
This is the most competitive award, I think, in the entire list.
Yeah, I agree with you in this list as well. And there's some names on here that people are gonna be like, where is Marvin Harrison Jr.? Where is Bo Nix? You talked about him as a waiver wire, the pickup. Why are you not having him up there? Well, we got 4 nominees in this one. We have Brian Thomas Jr. finished as wide receiver 4 on the season in half-point PPR. We have Brock Bowers, who finished as tight end 1 as a rookie and set all kind of rookie records. You have Malik Neighbors, who did finish wide receiver 7, and had a little bit of a slump in the middle when he was dealing with some concussions and injuries, but the last couple of weeks balled out, especially and balled out at the beginning of the season. And then Jaden Daniels, rookie quarterback for the Washington Commanders, finished as QB5, but also player 7 overall in fantasy football. So a lot of great nominees here. I want to get your thoughts on this one before I make my final decision.
As good of seasons as Neighbors and Daniels had, I think my choice is between Brian Thomas and Brock Bowers. The way I look at it, Brock Bowers playing a premium position at tight end had made such an impact in a year where tight ends were an absolute mess for at least the first half of the season or more. It did start to get a little bit better near the end when we got back Hawkinson, when Kelsey started to come together. But the one consistent the entire season was Brock Bowers, and the boost that people got by having him was invaluable. Brian Thomas was almost like the perfect Band-Aid for all the teams that drafted him. I know I had multiple leagues where I took a late round flyer on Brian Thomas, not expecting too much, had a key injury, or had a wide receiver that was drafted high that was struggling, or even a flex. And Brian Thomas was able to just go in there, despite some criticism or skepticism every single week, and just perform pretty much the entire season, minus the 1 or 2 weeks where he was dealing with his rib injury. So those two were the biggest impact in fantasy, at least from my experience.
No, I completely agree. It's a 2-man race for me as well. And I'm going to just talk it out through here. I might get some feedback from me. And it's, where do you put positional value?
Mhm.
Because when it comes to tight end, there's only 4 tight ends in fantasy football this year that averaged over 10 points per game, half point PPR. Brock Bowers led them, averaging 12 points per game. Wide receiver, there is, what does this say? 30 some wide receivers that averaged more than 10 points per game. Brian Thomas is up at 14. That's one of the highest there is. Is actually 12, but that just goes to show. So, like in terms of positional value, but he scored 35 more points than Brock Bowers. So it's I'm going back and forth for that one. Also interesting, Brian Thomas had like 20 more targets than uh Brock Bowers had, but like 20 less catches, which is kind of wild.
Wow. Yeah, that is pretty wild.
But all that to say, because of the positional versatility, where you got him in the draft, this is not unanimous. This is a close race, but I'm going to give it to Brock Bowers.
I think that was the right move because of the position. If you had Brock Bowers at wide receiver and Brian Thomas at wide receiver, Brian Thomas takes it. Like, I think Brock Bowers falls to right around where Malik Neighbors is. But because of being a tight end in a year where we did nothing but complain about tight ends for at least 8 weeks, it was massive.
I agree. And just so it is for anyone that cares, Brian Thomas had 133 targets this year for 87 catches, where Brock Bowers only had 100 or he had 153 targets. It refreshed on me. So I lied. He had more targets and more catches. Makes sense.
Does make sense. But good fight of rookies. I hope we get as good of a rookie class next year as we did this year. But we'll see if people overdraft on some rookies next year, hoping to get that lightning in a bottle like we got this year. Fantasy playoff MVP. So not quite to fantasy MVP yet, but fantasy playoff MVP. Starting it off with running back Bucky Irving, who scored 13.3, 18.2, and 23 in the final 3 weeks of the season, your fantasy playoffs. Also at running back, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, 25.9, 23.4, 24.3, and Cody sprinkled in week 18 at 43.5 points if you had a week 18 game. Massive once Montgomery left. Baker Mayfield at quarterback, 28, 22.3, and 34.6 in his final 3 weeks. And then Jonathan Taylor, if you survived his 11.6 and that drop touchdown at the goal line in the first round of the fantasy playoffs, he awarded you greatly with a 39.8 and 26.6. I'm the final decision on this one, Cody. Do you have anybody who you would argue for or against before I go?
Yeah, I mean, that drop touchdown, I think makes a huge difference because that's 8-point swing. So you're looking at 19.6 there, which I think puts him into consideration. But because of that, I think that eliminates him. I'd love to give it to Bucky Irving because of him being a waiver wire addition, later in the season.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's between Baker Mayfield and Jahmyr Gibbs. And Baker Mayfield was a guy you might have been able to trade for or put in a waiver wire, where Gibbs, he was pretty good all season. In full point PPR, he finishes RB1. Half point PPR, Saquon Barkley passed him because he did a lot of work out of the backfield. And a lot of that has to do with his 43 points in week 18. So some people may say that doesn't count because most people don't play fantasy football then. But for me, I think I'm going to have to lean Jahmyr Gibbs, but I would not be upset if you give it to Baker.
Baker made a very strong run. I think the biggest thing with Baker is a lot of the teams that had Baker, I've noticed, at least in my experience, he was on a bench or he was traded for late to a team that was almost on a desperation run because they were lacking quarterback play. Like, he made a big impact for a lot of people, but I feel like that plus positional value kind of degrades a little bit of.
Remember, this is fantasy playoff MVP. So where
Yes.
you were at and where the teams were at should not truly matter. But I do understand where you're going at. Well, like, did you even get the opportunity to play him in the
Yeah,
fantasy playoffs?
exactly. But I'm also looking at 28, 22, 34, great numbers, not as big of a gap compared to some other quarterbacks, especially when you had Josh Allen start off that first week of the fantasy playoffs with 44 and et cetera.
Then
But
2
there were
duds.
some quarterbacks hurt as well. So that's a tough one. Gibbs was just consistent the whole way through. He's somebody who you rode the whole time. But in the fantasy playoffs, like that consistency is what you're looking for, and he carried a lot of teams. The breaking point for me is I wanted to give it to Jonathan Taylor. And like you said, that drop touchdown is what definitely moves the needle for me. Because a lot of people didn't move on because of Jonathan Taylor dropping that touchdown at the goal line and only having 11 points. I'm going to give it to Jahmyr Gibbs for that consistency of 23 plus through the 3 weeks.
I also just want to give a shout out to our good friend Kempy of the show, who pulled off a trade to get Jahmyr Gibbs before the Montgomery injury, pulled off another trade to get Baker Mayfield, but that trade required him giving up Quentin Johnson, who kept him out of the playoffs. But if he would have made the playoffs, he would have had 2 of our fantasy MVPs on his roster. So those in-season moves can hurt you, but they can also break you.
He would have been a team to watch out for in our League of Record playoffs. Instead, I made it through, survived the Jonathan Taylor drop touchdown, and could not make it happen in the second week despite the 39 points.
Yeah, one of the very few. But last up is fantasy MVP. We got a couple minutes left on the show. Best overall fantasy player. There's a couple nominations here, and really it comes down to the best player at each position. We're going on half point PPR, so Saquon Barkley would be running back 1. Full point PPR, like we mentioned, it would be Gibbs by a couple points, but a lot of that is the 43 in week 18. Barkley also didn't play in week 18, so I think Barkley would have been the RB1 if they both played. Jamar Chase, Triple Crown winner, wide receiver 1, and then Lamar Jackson, quarterback 1 at 430 points with 40 plus touchdowns, only 4 interceptions and 900 rushing yards. Again, the rushing becomes a cheat code when it comes to the quarterback. And this one is tough for me. It really is on where do I want to go. It's hard for me not to give it to a Triple Crown winner when, he put up points, especially after he did have a slow start because of his holdout. And when you have Lamar averaging 25 points a game, but then you have, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow right behind him at 22, basically 21.9, and then Baker Mayfield is even at 21. It's like how much of that positional value is difference where the next highest wide receiver on the list is Justin Jefferson down at player 21 at 15.6, and Jamar Chase is up at 20. So for me, it's between Jamar Chase and Lamar Jackson, but you were talking to me pre-show about Lamar having one of the best fantasy seasons ever. So tell me about that and see if you can sway me.
So I have actually a couple of things to hit on here. So I'll just go on a couple minute rant probably. So I'll start with the Lamar Jackson point you made. So we're counting all 18 weeks here. But I saw a stat come over. I had to go fact check it before the show. Lamar Jackson officially finished the best fantasy point quarterback season of all time. He passed Patrick Mahomes back in 2019, who had 417 fantasy points. Lamar finished the year with 430. There's been a couple of players, sparsely that have beat that number, mostly in full PPR. People like LaDainian Tomlinson, or I think it was 2019, Christian McCaffrey was up there who had like almost 500 points. But when it comes to quarterbacks, Lamar actually broke the record for best fantasy point quarterback season of all time. I think that is a pretty big boost when it comes to trying to name him the MVP. And I was thinking like just Josh Allen go on this list because of some of those big weeks. But despite those big weeks, he still outscored Josh Allen by almost 50 fantasy points. So that's pretty crazy. The other thing I wanted to look at, what was that?
Josh Allen also didn't play week 18.
So you could call it 30 points. And say he scored his normal 20-ish.
Okay.
Anyway, the other thing I was trying to look at that I thought was kind of interesting, I was trying to see, most of the time, especially with the wide receiver position, you don't see a wide receiver outscore his quarterback, or you don't see a position player in general outscore his quarterback. And I was trying to see if that happened anywhere this year. It did not, for the most part. The one place it did happen, which I think is really interesting, he's not one of our nominees. Jahmyr Gibbs did outscore Jared Goff. And then Saquon did outscore Jalen Hurts, but Jalen Hurts would have outscored him if he played those 2 games at the end of the season. Jamar Chase still came within 30 points of outscoring Joe Burrow in half PPR. If you tune that up to PPR, he outscored Joe Burrow. Not often you see a wide receiver outscore the guy that's throwing to him.
Dude, you haven't helped. You made the case for Lamar, and now you gave it right back to Jamar Chase.
Yep. This award plus the rookie award is why I was glad I got the draw I did. I did not want to make either of these decisions. I think as much as I want to be a homer, Saquon's out of this conversation. I think the Triple Crown plus the fact that we had a wide receiver outscore his pass, the person throwing the ball, I would lean Jamar Chase. Despite Lamar Jackson's great season. That's my advice to you. I gave you all of my number barf that I had in my head. Congratulations. Make the decision.
Well, thank you. So I was leaning Jamar Chase, but then the whole best season ever for a quarterback at 430. Yes, there's an extra game, but Patrick Mahomes, I believe, had the extra game back too when he did it.
He did have the extra game when he did it, yes.
So it's such a tough decision, and I think there is really only one way. In true
he's not.
True Couch GM's fashion to figure out how to do this.
As he throws Saquon on the list too, and then it rolls Saquon.
Nope, it's between Jamar Chase and Lamar. And you know what that means. It is time for the Wheel of Names to decide everything. The wheel is spinning for people that are listening to this podcast. We have the Wheel of Names. I should have done more variants, so it makes it a little bit more interesting, but I set this up on the fly. George says Jamar Chase. The wheel says Jamar Chase as the tie-breaking vote. We are going to go with Jamar Chase as fantasy MVP, despite the record-breaking performance for Lamar Jackson. And Lamar got screwed over in our fantasy MVP, and he's going to get screwed over in the NFL MVP for Josh Allen.
Yes, he is. But Saquon Barkley for Offensive Player of the Year, despite the Triple Crown.
What? Yeah. So Jamar Chase is going to get screwed over in that one. So
we'll give Jamar Chase an award he's not going to get in real life. Thank you for Jamar Chase, and congrats on getting the Couch GM's Fantasy MVP. We'll do our NFL awards before the Pro Bowl, so stay tuned with us through the playoffs for that one.
Do we even talk about the Pro Bowl?
We don't talk about the Pro Bowl. That's why we do NFL awards at that point.
I meant like snubs and all that stuff, but like I think we've gotten to the point like we don't even care about the Pro Bowl, so you shouldn't either.
Tune in for the dodgeball. We can't even watch Tyreek Hill put a move on somebody in flag football this year.
Yeah, he didn't get voted in. That's kind of, I mean, we talked about it. It's worth it, but it's definitely something of interest. But we have no Monday night game to talk about. Like, what do you?
We don't.
So, last question before we get out of here. What do you do on the first Monday without football since September?
I was thinking about this before we even jumped on to record. I didn't come up with a good answer. I feel like a lost puppy almost. It's like we have a routine. We come on here, we talk to everybody, we have a good time, and then we jump off and we watch Monday Night Football. But this is the start of I almost feel like it's like the Sunday blues where it's like, oh no, I have to go back to work tomorrow. It's like this is where you start realizing the NFL season's almost over, and you get really sad where it's like we still have plenty of games to go in the playoffs. I'm super excited about a lot of them, but we're starting to dwindle down. And then the Pro Bowl especially is that first week where it hits you like, oh no, we're at the end.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. The good news is we have Monday Night Football back next week as a playoff game. Then we have a lot of great football this week. We didn't talk about it. College football playoffs Thursday and Friday into Saturday, Sunday, Monday of NFL playoffs. What a week to be alive when we're talking football, and there's our 10 seconds of college Do you have something to
Maybe
add?
we'll have a Thursday night college preview to hit you guys with on Thursday.
Man, George be ready to go, get ready to watch that Penn State game. But
Yeah, man.
that's because we are still live Mondays and Thursdays. Talk some betting, talk some awards. Who knows? Make sure you join us in the chat, or if you're on the podcast version, hit subscribe, follow it so you notify when we post new episodes every day after the live, so they're in your podcast feeds. Follow us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, TikTok, all those places at the Couch GMs. I'm Cody Roadcap. That's George Kurth, and we'll talk to you on Thursday.